Please join with me in prayer. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. What are your favorite binge-worthy shows? I know you have them. Jack and I have several, and a few that we have enjoyed. Downton Abbey. There's a new movie coming out that we're really excited about. Game of Thrones, and most recently, when our kids would not stop talking about it, Stranger Things. What makes a good binge-worthy show? Well, first, you really have to be invested with the characters, don't you? Most of the time, these characters have major flaws, right? And there is major drama going on. And sometimes you have both. Most of the time you have both. But also, there is usually a storyline of growth, or of overcoming obstacles, of grace, good triumphing over evil. Those are the things that hook us. A good storyline with people that we can relate to, because let's face it, we are all characters in our own storylines with major flaws, and we are longing for the grace and the growth. So today, we find ourselves looking at Abram and Sarai. Their names haven't changed yet when we meet them. These are God's chosen couple. They are to be the first family of God. You know, the God of Abraham, the God of Sarah. And there's even a song, which unfortunately John hushed me when I suggested that maybe we should have it today. But you know it, right? Father Abraham had many sons. Right? You can sing it with me. Many sons had Father Abraham, and you were one of them, and so am I. So let's all praise the Lord. And then we get to throw our arms and our legs and our whole bodies in the song, right? Because we're all descendants. The thing is, when the story of Abram and Sarai opens, they're old. They have no children. But God tells Abram to leave his family, leave his land. And then God tells Abram that he will have his own nation, and that God will give his descendants the land of Canaan. Now, I did mention that Abram was 75, didn't I? And that Sarai was around 65? That's when God showed up to make this promise. And I'm pretty sure that all of this came as news to the Canaanites too. Are we binge-worthy yet? I'm not sure. I think we should give it another episode. So, Abram and Sarai go. They trust God's promise. They head into the wilderness and they spend years there. They cover hundreds of miles, and twice Abram tries to pass Sarai off as his sister to save his own skin. And both times they are discovered at the very last minute before a foreign leader takes Sarai as his wife. Whew. These are God's chosen people. So after many years, God appears and makes his promise again. And they're still waiting. They continue to wait. And there are still no children. Abram even rescues his nephew Lot and wins a great battle. Can you just see that scene? We've got a wonderful battle scene in here. Victory and no kids. In fact, God was so proud of Abram for his victory and his bravery and skill in that battle that he shows up to praise Abram. And what does Abram say? Hey, God, I'm really glad that you're proud of me and all. I still don't have any kids. What are you going to do about that? But God doesn't get annoyed or angry. Instead, he takes Abram outside and he points to the sky. And he makes the promise again that Abram will have as many descendants as stars in the sky. Okay. It's getting a little interesting here. Let's keep going. So our next episode opens and we find Sarai still not pregnant. She's still waiting. She's still old. And she's tired. So she starts second-guessing God's promises. Maybe I wasn't part of this promise for kids. Maybe only Abram was the one with whom God made this covenant. So she starts plotting. She starts scheming. And she starts taking matters into her own hands. God promised Abram descendants. Well, okay. Well, by golly, we're going to have descendants. So Sarai comes up with the plan that she thinks makes the most sense. Her slave, Hagar, is young and she's pretty. So if Abram lies with Hagar, then any children born will be Abram's by law. So Sarai convinces her husband to go and lie with her slave. And of course, Hagar becomes pregnant. She gives birth to Ishmael. So now we have Hagar, who now hates Sarai. Sarai is put out with Abram because he actually did what she wanted him to do. And Hagar tries to run away, take Ishmael the baby, and disappear. It is a holy mess. Are you hooked yet? So we flash forward about 15 years or so. Abram is now 99. Sarai is around 90. Sarai still has no children. And God appears again and restates the covenant that God made with Abram, and now he changes the names. He gives Abram the name of Abraham, and Sarai becomes Sarah. And what's the significance here of changing their names? God makes his promise clear. Abraham and Sarah mean the father and the mother of many nations. And God specifically states that Sarah will have a son. So upon hearing this, Abraham falls over with laughter. He's 99. But he trusts God. Do I have time for another episode? Okay. So, things are getting good now, aren't they? Now we open, and there are 3 strangers that show up outside of Abraham and Sarah's tent. Now, in Abraham's time, strangers were always welcome. Now, there's a sermon there, but it's not today's sermon, so we'll save that one. But Abraham tells Sarah to bake bread. They throw a party of sorts to welcome these strangers to their home. But soon, though, it becomes clear that these are no ordinary strangers. Sarah is asked about by name. She is hiding out of sight, and she's listening behind the illusion of safety. And it is revealed that God is one of these strangers. God tells Abraham that the wait is almost over, because in a year, Sarah will have that son. Now, you realize it's been over 2 decades. God's been showing up. God's been making these promises. Sarah is 90. She physically cannot have children anymore. And yet here is God making this crazy promise. What would you do if God showed up and made a promise like that to you? Probably the same thing that Sarah did. she laughed. And she laughed out of disbelief. She laughed at the thought of even the mere possibility. Me? Now? There's no way. And God heard her, because God hears us all the time, doesn't he? And God called her out. And God made sure that she knew that nothing is impossible for God. And our mini-series on God Flicks closes with Sarah at 91, laughing and holding her son Isaac, whose name literally means laughter. All right, that was pretty good, wasn't it? God made a promise. God fulfilled that promise. But God took God's own sweet time doing it. Have you ever found yourself laughing at God? Or becoming impatient, waiting on God? I'm certain that I am not the only one. As human beings, especially in this time of growing technology and fast-paced society that we live in, I believe that the patience and delayed gratification are becoming harder and harder for us to tolerate, as if they were really ever easy. But God's timing is not our timing. Are you in this waiting land now? Bruce Wilkinson has a wonderful little book, and it's called The Dream Giver. And in that book, he describes this place as the wasteland. Miles and miles of nothing but sand, rocks, and a few scraggly trees. Does that sound familiar? But you know, deep in your heart, that God has promised you something. Healing or provision or something else that you have prayed for. Just like the main character, Ordinary, in The Dream Giver, he has been given a dream. And this waiting wasteland can be very frustrating, and you don't want to find yourself there. It's like being stuck in traffic for hours and hours on end, and you become more and more irritated that you can't move. Kind of reminds me sometimes of I-40 with all the construction. Cars are blocking you everywhere, and you're sick of the waiting. You want to arrive at your destination, and you may be tempted to watch for just the slightest opening. Jerk your car out, drive down the emergency lane, and whip yourself back in down the line. But that's what Sarah did. She got tired of waiting. She got tired of God's timing. She took things into her own hands and gave her husband to another woman. Talk about a messy and an awkward situation, right? Ordinary, in The Dream Giver, took a shortcut too, and he ended up in quicksand. When we attempt to think that we can do things faster or better than God, we end up making our own holy mess of things. Yes, years of waiting and disappointment can be torturous, and you may be in that season right now. But remember what God said to Sarah. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? And if nothing is too difficult for the Lord, why is it that we can't keep trusting in God's timing? Most of us seem to trust in ourselves more than we trust in God. And this, my friends, this is when we get into trouble. If Sarah became pregnant instantly when God made that promise, and they had a wonderful little family and a white picket fence, and nothing ever went wrong, Where would God fit into that? Would God receive the glory for that sweet nuclear family? Maybe. Probably not. But when Sarah gives birth to Isaac at 91 years old, there is absolutely no question that God's hand was in that miracle. When we trust in God, God gets the glory, not us. There is no problem that you are facing nor dream that is too big for God. There are no circumstances that are outside of God's control. God did not choose Abraham and Sarah to be the mother and the father of many nations because they were perfect or that they had it all together. No, far from it. God chose them because they were not perfect. God uses this story of Abraham and Sarah to call us into this family, into the big, messy family of God. This is the same family that God called a stuttering Moses into. This is the same family that God called a small shepherd boy named David into. And this is the same family that God called, if you can see it up there, an awkward girl of 13 who wore a skinny tie and a corduroy jacket into. That's me. Look at the family of God. Every single one of us is a hot mess. But if we weren't, God wouldn't be praised or noticed for the great and the wondrous things that God does for us and through us. A faithful life is a life of abundant patience. And I am confident that as I look out today at each one of you, patience is something that all of us can work on. There's a story of a great New England preacher named Philip Brooks. He was known for his poise and his quiet manner. At times, however, even he suffered moments of frustration and irritability. One day, a friend saw him feverishly pacing the floor like a caged lion. "What's the trouble, Mr. Brooks?" he said. "The trouble is," he responded, "I am in a hurry, but God isn't." Friends, God doesn't work on our timing, but God is always on time. And your time is coming. You have to keep the faith and you keep believing. Even in the wasteland of waiting, God is there. And remember that God will always have the last laugh. Amen.